Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're tuning in today because we are tackling a fascinating and honestly, a highly critical piece of our modern infrastructure. Today, we're using the SASB Waste Management Standard as our roadmap to navigate this complex, often totally unseen world. We're going to be breaking down exactly how environmental risks are measured, tracked, and translated into hard data that corporations and investors literally cannot afford to ignore.
Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to just pause for a second and imagine a single drop of toxic liquid seeping quietly into the earth beneath a massive landfill. I mean, it seems incredibly small, right? Almost insignificant. But what happens when that one tiny drop becomes a steady, continuous leak? That hidden seepage is exactly what we're focusing on today. We're looking at the massive environmental and financial stakes of what goes into the ground and, more importantly, what escapes from it.
To really wrap our heads around the scale of this issue, we first need to define exactly what makes this waste so incredibly dangerous. The standard actually categorizes hazardous materials based on 4 distinct characteristics: ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. So we are definitely not talking about your average household trash here. This is highly volatile stuff that absolutely demands strict, targeted management.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that focus on a crucial term you might not hear every day, but one that threatens local communities directly, and that's leachate. Leachate is essentially the toxic byproduct of poor landfill management. It's this contaminated liquid that forms when rainwater filters down through all that solid and hazardous waste we just talked about, picking up dissolved chemicals along the way. If a disposal site isn't properly sealed and managed, this toxic soup doesn't just stay put. No, it actively threatens the surrounding soil and the groundwater that entire communities rely on.
And the stakes here, they scale up incredibly fast. On the microscopic level, we have severe ecological impacts. We are talking about serious groundwater and soil contamination that can utterly devastate local ecosystems and human health. But the fallout doesn't just stop at the fence line of the landfill. It scales all the way up to the corporate boardroom. When these disposal sites are improperly managed, companies face a massive corporate impact. We're talking about crippling regulatory penalties, super expensive lawsuits, impaired future business prospects, and a total loss of brand value. Literally, a leak in the ground translates directly to a leak in the balance sheet.
Right, so how on earth do we keep track of all this? Well, that is exactly where the SASB standards step in. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board framework acts as this crucial accounting tool that basically forces transparency onto these toxic risks. It provides a standardized language so that companies have to report their environmental management in a way that investors, regulators, and the public can actually understand and compare. It essentially turns abstract environmental threats into hard, measurable data.
All right, moving right along to Section 1, Tracking Toxic Releases, under code IFWM 150A.1.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real detective work of our explainer. Let's look at the actual metrics auditors use to track a company's environmental footprint. Under this specific metric, the standard forces companies to show their cards. A company has to report its total toxic release inventory, or TRI, measured in metric tons. But it doesn't stop there. They also have to disclose the exact percentage of that inventory that was released into the water supply. And the definition of a release here is incredibly comprehensive. It includes any spilling, leaking, pumping, pouring, emitting, or leaching into the environment. So there is absolutely nowhere to hide a spill under this standard.
Now, you might be wondering, does this apply to every single small-town dump out there? Well, no. The standard establishes a specific threshold for this reporting. This strict toxic release inventory tracking applies to facilities regulated under jurisdictional laws that have 10 or more full-time employees. If a facility meets that threshold and processes chemicals above the regulatory limits, well, they are on the hook for this detailed reporting.
But what actually happens when a company breaks the rules? Under metric IFWM 150A.3, companies are required to disclose their formal enforcement actions. This means they must publicly report the total number of incidents of non-compliance associated with environmental impacts that actually result in administrative penalties or judicial actions. This specifically targets violations regarding ground and surface water contamination, as well as hazardous waste transport or disposal.
Next up, Section 2, Measuring Corrective Actions, code IF-WM-150A.2.
Tracking the damage is really just half the equation. Let's shift our narrative to how companies report the actions they actually take to stop the bleeding and mitigate the damage when a release does occur. When a landfill releases constituents above established background levels, Corrective actions have to be implemented, and companies have to count and report them. The standard outlines specific steps for this mitigation. This includes measuring site-specific field data and installing gas monitoring systems. Crucially, it also involves conducting groundwater monitoring. And this isn't just taking a quick look at a puddle. It involves drilling dedicated observation wells, obtaining deep subsurface samples, and conducting complex analytical procedures to measure the physical, chemical, and biological effects of the contaminants. It is a highly rigorous and, honestly, highly expensive remediation process.
So, the crucial point is that these accounting metrics, the actual codes mapping out toxic releases, corrective actions, and non-compliance, they serve a vital purpose. They successfully translate what could otherwise be completely hidden ecological disasters into highly visible, measurable financial risks on a corporate balance sheet. By forcing companies to quantify their leachate management, the SASB standards ensure that environmental accountability is directly and undeniably tied to financial performance.
Which brings us to the final and probably most important thought for you to take away today. With these standards in place, the data is officially out there. So, are the brands and municipalities you support properly managing their toxic footprint? Or are they hiding a costly, dangerous leak that could impact both their bottom line and your local environment? Armed with understanding of these metrics, you now know exactly where to look to find the answer. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep asking the tough questions.